Before I begin, I want to share with you that yesterday I had a phone call with my mom. She's a math teacher, and she's interested in my work. She's very supportive, and she showed interest and curious about this talk. She asked me, how do you plan to begin your talk tomorrow? And I told her I will begin talking about rats. She was shocked. And she thought that I was kidding. And she told me, rats? In Oxford University? You are going to talk about rats? And I told her, yes, Mom, I'm serious. Do you know why? Because our first and initial understanding about responses to trauma came from the neuroscience, and more specifically, from lab experiments with rats. So let's imagine together a classic, typical experiment with rats. Researchers bring a rat, put it in a cage, and they play a tone or a sound. At the same time, they deliver mild electric shock through the cage floor. And they do that for several repetitions. What happened is that after several times, the rats start to associate and link between the mild electric shock and the tone, which is the tone is like the neutral stimulus, and the mild electric shock is the threat or anticipated threat. And I have just to note that this shock isn't meant to be painful, but at least it's expected to cause unpleasant experience and trigger the fear response or trigger the defensive response among the rat. And what is interesting is that when they take this rat that underwent the fear conditioning to a new cage, one that smells and looks different, they found out that the rat acted normally. Once they played the tone by itself, the rat froze. And what was more interesting than that, when they took back the rat, all of these rats that underwent the fear conditioning to the original cage, if they found out that those rats, even in this case, when they took them back, they didn't implement any intervention, they found out that most of these rats were more likely to freeze than rats that didn't underwent all of this fear conditioning situation. And what we can learn from these experiments that responses to threat are not only about the threat itself, but also the environment where the threat happened. And what we see in rats, I think that the system, for some reason, okay, that's okay. What we see in rats, we see also in human beings. I tend to believe that most of you, if not all of you, know Cannon's fight or flight response. According to this model, once we detect a threat or a danger, the sympathetic nervous system is activated and releases stress hormones, leading to physiological change in our body, preparing it to fight or flight. Once the threat, the danger is over, the parasympathetic nervous system steps in, calm down the body, and bring it back to the balance. And the question is, do these models help us to understand how children respond to the abuse? Professor David Finkelhor, a well-known American researcher in this field, explored this question. He and his team conducted telephone interviews with 2,000 American students or children aged between 10 and 16. And they asked them mainly about two topics. The first topic was about their responses to previous incidents of abuse. And the second topic was mainly about whether these children had participated in prevention programs within their schools. And what they found is that the children who underwent or experienced or had participated in these prevention programs were more likely to use these 4 defensive strategies that you see in front of you, were more likely to disclose the abuse, and were less likely to blame themselves. But a striking finding was that they found out that children who fought back their abusers were at a serious danger. They faced serious injuries. And he raised this debate whether we should teach children to fight back their abusers. A recent study was conducted by Professor Permit Katz. She examined more than 200 forensic investigations with Jewish children in Israel. And we're talking about children that were referred to the child protection system and then were referred to the forensic investigation following reports on child physical or sexual abuse. And she found out that children tended to use the self-change, which was the most reported response among these children. She found that 24% of these children changed their behavior to survive the abuse. And this is the definition that Katz give for this adaptive response. She said that those children tried to survive the abuse. They changed their behavior, or may say adapted their behaviors to survive the abuse, to make the abuse less painful, and to end quickly. And we see here 2 quotes coming from 2 forensic investigations with children. During the presentation, I will not read the quote, but I will give you time to read it by yourselves. Can I proceed? And what she concluded is that in intrafamilial cases of abuse, children are dependent on their caregivers, even if these caregivers, their abusers, for their physical and emotional needs. And in these cases, in such contexts, the fight or flight are not relevant responses for these children. We wanted to take these insights a step further. We were interested to understand how children from minority group living in unstable socio-political contexts might respond to the abuse within their families. Our case study, Palestinians in Israel, my community. Palestinians in Israel make up about 21.1% of the Israeli population. We're talking about the biggest national and ethnic minority in Israel. Most of the Palestinians are Muslims, with smaller Christians and Druze minorities. I want also to emphasize that the Palestinian population in Israel includes several sub-communities of Palestinians who have common background, common characteristics, common challenge, but at the same time, for each community, it has its unique challenge. And Palestinians in Israel live across different regions in the country. Most of them live in separated villages and cities in the north. Some of them live in the center. And the third community are Bedouin living in the south. And among all the Palestinians in Israel, we have only about, may I say, less than 9% who live in mixed cities, meaning that most of the Palestinians in Israel live in separated areas. And regarding the, as we see here, the child abuse, we have mixed findings coming from the study about the rates, about the prevalence of child abuse. And the researchers explained that because of the chronic underreporting of cases on child sexual abuse. And from historical and political context, we are talking about indigenous people who were living in their homeland before the occupation and before the establishment of the Israeli state, who survived, resisted forced and violent immigration and displacement, and survived to stay in their homeland, where more than 750,000 of the Palestinians were forced to leave to the neighboring Arab countries. And also survived the forced immigration, faced and still face until this day discriminatory and racist practices and policies from the state. And to give a sense what I mean about discriminatory and racist practices and policies, I brought these examples for illustrations. As you see in this picture or this slide, the first photo illustrates the ongoing destruction of Palestinians' homes, mostly in East Jerusalem and in the south. And this photo came from the East Jerusalem, more specifically. The second photo illustrates the restrictions on the access to Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. And I want also to state here that in many cases, soldiers and the forces, the state forces, close the gates for the mosque, even before and at the time of the prayer times. The third photo presents the unrecognized Palestinian Bedouin village who live in the south. And those people resisted the forced displacement and unfortunately live in very poor conditions with a very serious lack of resources. We're talking about lack of electricity, lack of good water, lack of schools for the children. Many children in this community are not registered to schools. And we're talking about a serious lack in all of the services, including educational, healthcare, and the social services. And the fourth picture illustrates the erasure, illustrates the ongoing efforts by the Israeli state to erase the Palestinian identity. And what you see here is changing the names, the Arabic names of the streets to Hebrew names. And we don't have only this situation for the streets. Also, some villages and cities, their names were changed from Arabic to Hebrew. And may I say that these efforts also include banning the Palestinian flag. They also include restrictions on cultural, cultural activities and events, and among other things. And one of the striking examples for these racist policies is this law that was passed in the Knesset before 7 years. The Basic Law Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people officially defines Israel as the state of the Jews only, disregarding the Palestinian indigenous people, who most of them are Israeli citizens. And you can imagine what could be the consequences of such law in terms of resources, funding, services, and even on how the state treats the Palestinians who live within the state. And I do believe that numbers talk for themselves. In comparison to the Jewish majority, as we see here, most of the Palestinians in Israel face higher rates of poverty, lower rates of employment, both for women and men. We have less funding to the Arab Palestinian localities in comparison with the Jewish localities. And as you see here, about 95% of the Arab localities in Israel are ranked in the 5 bottom clusters, where most of the Jewish localities are ranked in the 5 top clusters. And this actually explains a lot about the services and the situation of the community. And one of the phenomena that I want to emphasize is the murder, the community violence, and the murder cases among the Palestinians. We're talking about escalating murder cases over the years, as you see here. And I want to say we're talking about mainly organizations of crime that do these murder cases, mostly among men and less among women. And I want to notify that most of the Palestinians in Israel believe that the state contributes to this situation. And before we move forward, I want to say that one of the researchers who is examining this phenomenon for the last years stated that if we want to count the Palestinians in Israel as a separated country, it's going to be ranked in the third place in the world after Colombia and Mexico in the number of the murder cases. And within this very challenging, very complicated context, we still need to protect children. We still need to try our best to understand their experiences, their daily lives, and how we can protect them. And to do so, we also need to understand how children respond to the abuse and why we have this serious underreporting issue among them. So the main questions that we asked is how children respond to intrafamilial abuse, what role the context play in these in shaping the responses, may I say, and what are the meanings and interpretations those adult survivors provide or attribute to their responses to childhood abuse. To examine these questions, we have 3 data sources. We have forensic investigations with children who were reported as undergoing sexual or physical abuse. We have one-on-one interviews with adult survivors. We have also testimonies that were submitted to the Israeli inquiry on child sexual abuse. And today, the findings that I'm going to present are mainly based on the retrospective accounts. As you see here, we are talking about 2 studies that were conducted at the same time. These 2 studies have the same questions, but as evident in this slide, they have a little bit different approach, different focus. Also, one of them was conducted in the context of my PhD research, and the second one was conducted in the context of the research of the Israeli inquiry. And as we see here, in my PhD research, I was more interested to understand the responses to physical abuse in these families. But however, some of these participants also reported about sexual abuse. And in the other side, we were more concerned about sexual abuse and how children respond to sexual abuse. And I want to make it clear that given the different approach, the different analysis method that was used here, I'm not aiming to compare between the findings of these studies, but mainly to take the common findings or the common themes that were raised in these studies and present them. And when we looked at the responses to childhood abuse, we found a remarkable diversity. These responses that you see in front of you could be ranged between internal, personal strategies to external ones. But as you see, we have more internal, personal strategies to survive the abuse than the external ones, and we will see why this is happening later. When we looked more closer to the findings, to these responses, it became clear that we're not talking about isolated actions. We're talking about the meanings behind those actions. What meanings were attributed by the participants to their responses and how they explained their responses to the abuse. And 3 main patterns emerged. These patterns of responses are shared by the interplay between 3 elements: how the child perceived the abusive reality, their sense of control, and their self-concept, how they perceive themselves within the interaction they have with people around them, including the perpetrators. If I want to explain briefly these patterns, I would say that I will try to explain them according to these three elements. The silenced child, which we also called the vulnerable child, was evident in physical and sexual abuse cases. We're talking about participants who believed that the abuse is an endless nightmare. They thought that this is an endless nightmare. It's gonna continue. We don't have any control to change our reality. And also they internalized the self-blame. They show a self-blame that was evident in these accounts. I think that also the helplessness feeling among these people was very evident and was very clear. And even some of them blamed themselves for the abuse, thought that they deserved it. And their main coping strategies were suppressing their emotional actions or reactions and invisibility, meaning that they tried as much as they could to suppress their emotional reactions, to suppress the call for crying, and to be invisible to their abusers, even though that we know that they live in the same homes, to avoid further abuse or further harm. The child who upholds tradition was more evident in physical abuse cases. We're talking about participants who perceived abuse within cultural and religious framework. For instance, they perceived abuse as human imperfections. They perceived abuse as the test from God. And they perceived abuse as harsh, but still justified discipline. They didn't thought that they can change their situation, but what was striking is that they perceived themselves as good children, as loyal children for their families, because all of their responses aimed to avoid the disclosure of the abuse and aimed to avoid the consequences of the disclosure on their families. The third pattern, the creative child, was also visited in both types of the abuse. We're talking about participants who perceive themselves as active agents. They can influence and affect their abusive reality. They utilized different strategies to survive the abuse, but at the same time, they wanted to prevent the disclosure. They wanted to shield their families from external intervention, and I will go back to this later. Not moving. Okay. These are some quotes illustrating some of the aspects that I referred to previously. When we try to understand and to dive into participants' reflections and explanations regarding their responses to the abuse, it became clear that their reflections draw or may say, referred to the border systems and their effect on their responses. They more specifically, they draw top-down processes or top-down forces that were rooted into the socio-cultural and state structures that shaped their daily lives, shaped how they behaved in general, and also shaped how they responded to the abuse. And one of the major themes that we didn't anticipated before this research and analysis is the rule of the space. And more specifically, the participants shared that their physical and social environment affected their daily lives and affected also their experiences and their response to the abuse. I want to make it clear that we started with inductive analysis. Once we have major themes, we try to understand and to deepen our understanding of these themes. And then we started looking for conceptual frameworks or theoretical concepts that might capture or will capture the experiences and the reflections that were raised by the participants. And we found out that the spatial theory, and more specifically terms coined by Edward Soja, very effective to reflect what is happening in these accounts. And before moving to the participants' accounts, I want to briefly explain about the first space. According to Soja, the first space is the material understanding of our spaces, the physical environment that could be measured and could be quantified. And it represents the daily routine, our daily routine, the structured daily life, and our physical environment that we interact with, like our homes, schools, workplaces. And it was evident in participants' account that they talked a lot about the physical environments of their homes. They shared that they live in, may say, very interconnected homes, physically crowded homes that were shaped by ongoing supervision, that were shaped by more shared space for the family and less space for the children, which actually represents the lack of privacy among them. And it was interesting that some of the participants tried to give a sort of metaphor for this physical environment. And according to these participants, they tried to draw a closed circle where they have a courtyard in the middle, in the center, surrounded by interconnected units for the extended family members. And it was very interesting to see how this physical design of these homes affected participants' feelings, experiences, and responses to the abuse. And this is the first quote I do believe reflects this idea about, or this understanding. This is the second quote. I want to state here that the architecture of Palestinian homes is rooted in political historical context. The way these homes were built refers to prior to the establishment of the state and continued after the establishment of the Israeli state. And this design, like the closed circle, was aimed to prevent external interventions or threats, for instance, political violence. But the same design was also, or might say, created an internal visibility and external invisibility, meaning that what was happening within this circle was known to all of the family members, including the abuse against children, where most of these cases of the abuse were disregarded by their family members. At the same time, it was invisible to the outside world, meaning that everything that was happening within this closed circle was hidden and invisible to the formal systems or other families. And this understanding leads us to the second term, the second space. Soja told us there is no neutral space. Our spaces are shaped by power, by politics, and by ideology. He also shared that people who hold power and knowledge have a very powerful decision on how our spaces are structured. For instance, let's just give this talk as an example, or this room as an example of this kind of space. Some people who have power and knowledge decided the sitting arrangement of this room. They decided that this room or this talk, it's gonna be hybrid, meaning that it's an apple. I mean, this space make it may I say enable participation for participants in person and also those remotely. And these are like some examples among other examples. And all of this structured room or structured talk affect our feelings, each one of us. How do we feel? How do we engage? How do we interact with this space? And taking this understanding to the participants' account, it was clear that they referred to how their spaces were embedded and shaped by socio-cultural influences. They referred to three main themes. The first one is the socialization to behavior. The second one is the gender norms. And the third one is the social constructs of the responses. For the first one, the participants shared that they were raised and socialized from the young age to behave, act, dress, and even feel in ways that pleasant their environment, in ways that align with the social expectations from their behaviors, as illustrated in the first quote, even at the cost of their feelings, own needs, own desires. The second interpretation is linked to the gender norms. Female participants in this research stated that as girls, their behaviors were tightly controlled by the fear of the family to protect their honor, their reputation. And this has actually affected their social lives, affected their movements, and caused for ongoing supervision on these girls' movements, social life, and etc. For boys, the pressure was a little bit different. Some of the male participants in this research shared that they were expected from their family members and community members to suppress their emotional reactions in general and also following the abuse. Otherwise, they will be termed as weak boys or even not men, as weak girls. And this explains largely why some of the participants, the male participants, shared us that they tried to find a private spot to express their emotions far away from their family members. And the third explanation is about how the society constructs and frames specific behaviors as accepted and not accepted behaviors. There is a very powerful power, may I say, from the society on these social constructs. For example, this quote illustrates that running away among women and girls, to run away from the home, to flee, is constructed by the society as a deviant behavior. As we see in this quote, I mean, it's reflected in a very powerful and beautiful way in this quote. And once the society constructs running away from the home as a deviant behavior, it holds many consequences on these women's lives, physical safety, connections with their families, and their future prospects. Besides to these sociocultural influences, the participants also talked about the role of the state, the role of the formal systems and institutions. I have to say first that most of them, if not all of them, showed a very deep mistrust of the formal systems. And many of them feared that the disclosure might be misused by the formal systems to break up their families or weaken their community. Only 4 participants, and those were women, out of 53 participants sought the formal assistance. And I know that 4 among 53 participants is not a big number to conclude from it. But I want to say that I do believe that this number has a lot to say. And those women that sought the formal help faced either indifference from the state or even complicit system or complicit formal systems that dismissed their call for protection and protected their abusers. And what was also interesting in this research is that we try to understand how the participants perceive the child abuse within, may say, political and historical context, how they perceive what happened with them. And these 2 interpretations were mostly coming from the physical abuse cases. The first one, some of the participants acknowledged the abuse consequences. They said that it was a very difficult abusive experience with long and short-term consequences. At the same time, they called to acknowledge the abuser history. They stated that their family members experienced exclusion, discrimination, forced migration, as we see here in this quote. And all of these experiences affected their mental status and their cognitive processes. The second interpretation was interesting because those participants highlighted the benefit of the violent behavior. They shared that our family members, our caregivers, knew exactly what's going to happen for us in the future. They tried to strengthen us. They tried to prepare us for the worst. And this is what was their way to prepare us for this difficult life, for this difficult to live in this difficult context. And here I want to shortly refer to the concept of Paulo Freire, which is the internalized oppression. Paulo Freire, most influential work on the oppressed and the oppressors, he stated that the oppressed people may be not able to confront their oppressors. So what they do, they internalize the oppression and they direct it against their community members or family members, and especially those who are perceived with less status and less power than them, mostly women and children. Within this very complicated and challenging context, what we understand from this is that children are not only expected, the participants said that they also were expected to be part of the collective sumud response against oppression, but also they believed that they should be part of the collective response against oppression. And in such situation, their everyday lives, their behaviors, their spaces, and their responses are not private anymore. We're talking about political spaces, political responses, and political lives. And I want just to say that sumud is a Palestinian concept. It's very relevant to Palestinians around the world, but more specifically for Palestinians who live in Israel, it means persistence. To persist in your homeland despite all of the manifestations of the oppression, despite the exclusion, despite the discrimination, to persist and stay in your homeland. And we can see how these responses might be a sort of reflect, may I say, some kind or some type of a somewhat response for all of the community. Within this situation, one of the main experiences that came out and was very strong is the entrapment experience. Many participants shared that they felt trapped within a space that they want to protect their families, but they couldn't do that. They want to survive the abuse, sorry, but they couldn't do that because they want at the same time to protect their families. And one of the strongest metaphors that came within these accounts was the chicken coop, which I do believe that it illustrates the emotional and the spatial confinement these participants felt. Within this context, or within this challenging context, we found out that some participants reported about interesting strategies. As I said before, they wanted to survive abuse, they wanted strongly to survive abuse. At the same time, they wanted to protect their families and shield them from external interventions. And this brings us back to the creative child. We found out that some participants utilized the physical environment, they navigated the physical environment, they affected and influenced the way their perpetrators perceive what is happening, perceive the reality to survive the abuse and avoid further harm. Some of the participants also used imagination. They imagined mental spaces of hope. They imagined also a better future for them, their families, for their community. They also imagined alternative realities, even in the darkest moment of the abuse. And the third strategy was more symbolic, may say, meaning to some of the locations that were felt by the participants as the sources, providing them with relief, comfort, and healing. And these are some of the quotes that illustrate these three strategies. And this leads us to the third concept of Soja, the third space. And I will try to make it simple. It's a very complicated, beautiful concept. And I truly recommend reading his book on third space. What Soja told us that the first space is the physical environment. The second space is the structured environment or spaces as imagined by those who had power and knowledge to structure them or to design them. The third space is the lived experience. And if I want to take this understanding to our participants, what this means is that the first space and the second space, both the structured lives and the physical environments, tried to objectify the children, perceive the children as objects, as passive recipients of the message that should behave in according to these messages. But at the third space, So just stated that, and he also used the term critical dialectics of space, meaning that he stated that people are not passive agents. They are also active agents that can affect their spaces, and they also have some power to feel their spaces and experience their spaces in different ways. And he also in his book cited Bell Hooks, and he referred to the oppressed minorities, may I say, and he saw this third space as a space of resistance, even subtle resistance, because as we see here, the participants also resisted in an uncovered way, resisted their abusers, their family members, tried as much as they could to navigate their environment, to navigate the perception of their abusers about the reality, and at the same time, they tried to resist their oppressors. And this leads us to the conceptualization that we define based on this understanding in this research. I just want to add to this that we understood that the need for survival, the sumud, which is the collective response to oppression, the social identity of these children, and the resistance, even subtle resistance, came together in this space. And I just want to add to that many of the participants stated about the nature and how they feel their nature, how they feel the soil, how they feel the land, looking for private spots under the trees where they can find some meaning of what is happening for their survival. And if you ask me what are your conclusions from these very difficult results, I might respond that one of the main conclusions is that we should invest in the prevention of child abuse. And this is why I'm here. And I was blessed to be here in this incredible department, is to work on the prevention, to establish intervention programs that can assist us to prevent abuse, at the same time consider the political context, consider the social context, and assist those children not to go through all of that difficult and destructive situation and experiences. And finally, I want to thank the participants of this research for opening their hearts, for sharing openly their stories and experiences and insights. In addition, I want to thank all of the institutions that make this research, make this research as happening or enable this research and supported this research, and also those who are supporting the current research that we are conducting. I want just to end with one quote. One of the questions that I was asked during this time, during this super difficult time, is how you think that an intervention you might develop might work. I mean, are you blind? The situation in your region is very difficult. The mistrust is very deep. How we can build an intervention and have this hope that this intervention might help children and their families to prevent abuse. And usually what I say, I quote the quote of the icon of the civil society, which said, he said, we're talking about Will Adams, that he said, if not now, then when? And if not us, then who? So with these beautiful words, I will end my talk, and thank you so much for your listening.